Attend, O reader, our tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. Uh, Last week we finished up our story we were on, or we finished up the Wizard of Oz, and then we did a couple of little encoding overloaded. How? How is my encoding overloaded right now? That's not possible. Literally, only OBS is open, and a book reader. This does not take up that much computer space. Anyway, I digress. Last week we finished up Wizard of Oz and read a couple of fun little short stories, including one in which the standard cheesy time dilation plot from every science fiction novel you read actually came up with a good ending. I've never seen it have a good ending, and it's just wild to me that it even can end well. Um, And that's what we did last week. We had a great time with Wizard of Oz, and now we're gonna lean in to books that involve another world that I very thoroughly enjoyed content from as a small child, and we're gonna start with The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. No, no, not Helena Grace. Yes, the actual H.G. Wells. I think it's Harold George Wells. Friendly reminder that we have a little drinking game going on whenever we are reading an H.G. Wells novel. If you hear any of the following, take a drink of water. I mean, if you're of drinking age, you can drink alcohol, but I'm not your dad. But, please drink water. It's a lot of them. If we hear any of the following words, take a drink. Tumult, zenith, the phrase for a space, terrible, and peculiar. H.G. Wells loves these words, and they will be coming up just a whole lot. So I once again must heartily stress, please drink water. I know I say it's a drinking game, and most people immediately think alcohol for that, but you're not gonna want to drink alcohol for this. It comes up so often. Please commit yourself to hydrating instead. I promise it's a good idea. There is a spider on my ceiling right now. I'm looking up right at him, and he is not paying rent because I saw some ladybugs in here yesterday. Pay rent, sir. I will let you live for now. Hi, yeah. I see you up there scuttling around with your 8 legs and way too many eyes. Yeah, I see you. I'd squish you if I could get up that high on the ceiling. Keep going left so I can get you. He's not paying rent. That's my thing about spiders, is I allow one spider into my home, just one, and then it takes care of the bug problem for me, and so then it's not a problem anymore. As long as the spider continues to pay rent, we're fine. But this spider, right up there, he's not paying rent, and he can hear me talking about him because he's scuttling around like, you know, you little 8-legged bug boy. He's scuttling. He's scuttling. Hang on, I need to get this man. Where? I need something to squish this man with. Hey, sir, you're not paying rent, so you get squished. Everybody hold your breath and hope it's not full of baby spiders. Success. No baby spiders. Spider deleted. That is a genuine fear I have every time I squish a spider, is that it's going to be full of a litany of other smaller spiders, and I'm just going to have a wave of spiders pour down my arm. It's going to happen one of these times. Or I'm going to squish it on the floor, and the wave of spiders is going to out onto the floor, and I'm going to start panicking. Before we zone in a little too hard on that particularly terrifying image, let's get started, shall we? Dive into Chapter 1, the introduction. The time traveler, so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. His pale grey eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burned brightly. The soft radiance of the incandescent lights and the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon, and there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought runs gracefully free of the trammels of precision. And he put it to us in this way, making the points with a lean forefinger, as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought it, and his fecundity. Now, you must follow me carefully. I shall have to convert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school, is founded on a misconception. That not a rather large thing to expect us to begin upon? Said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable grounds for it. You'll soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line of a thickness nil has no real existence. They taught you that? Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. That's right, said the psychologist. Nor, having only length, breadth, and thickness, can a cube have real existence. Well, there I object. Of course a solid body may exist, all real things. Well, so most people think. But wait a moment, can an instantaneous cube exist? I don't follow you. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? At this, Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveler proceeded, any real body must have extension in four directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I'll explain to you in a moment, we incline to overlook this fact. There are really four dimensions, three which we call the three planes of space, and a fourth, that being time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former three dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the ladder from the beginning to the end of our lives. That, said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp, that's very clear indeed. Now, it's very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveler, with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the fourth dimension, though some people who talk about the fourth dimension do not know they mean it. It's only another way of looking at time. There's no difference between time and any of the other three dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. But some foolish people have got a hold of the wrong side of that idea. You've all heard what they have to say about this fourth dimension? Well, I haven't, said the provincial mayor. It is simply this, that space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having three dimensions. One may call them length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to three planes, each at right angles to each other. But some philosophical people have been asking why three dimensions particularly, why not another direction at right angles to the other three, and have even tried to construct four-dimensional geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. You know how on a flat surface, which has only two dimensions, we can represent a figure of three-dimensional solid, and similarly they think that by models of three dimensions they could represent one of four, if they could master the perspective of the thing. Do you see? I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said, after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. Well, I do not mind telling you that I've been at work upon this geometry of four dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, here's a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on and so forth. All these are evidently sections, as it were, three-dimensional representations of his four-dimension being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people, proceeded the time traveler, after the pause required for the proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a sort of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high, yesterday night it fell, then this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally we recognize, but certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must conclude was along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is really only a fourth dimension of space, why is it, and why has it always been regarded as something different? Why cannot we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? The the time traveler smiled at this. Are you so sure you can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backward and forward freely enough, and men have always done so. I admit we move freely in two dimensions, but how about up and down? Gravitation limits us there. And not exactly, there are balloons. But before the balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still, they can move a little up and down. Easier, far easier down than up. And you cannot move at all in time. You just can't get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that's just where you're wrong. That's just where the whole world has gone wrong, you see. We're always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial, they have no dimensions. They're passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave, just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty is this. You can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. That is the germ of my great discovery, but you're wrong to say we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I am recalling an incident very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded, as you say. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has of staying 6 feet above the ground, but a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon, and why should he not hope that he ultimately be able to stop or accelerate his drift upon the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way? No, this is all... Why not? It's against reason. What reason? You can show black is white by your arguments, but you'll never convince me. Possibly not. But now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago I had a vague inkling of a machine to travel through time that shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time as the driver determines. Philby contented himself with laughter. I have experimental verification. It'd be remarkably convenient for the historian. One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance. Don't you think you would attract attention? Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato. In which case they would certainly plough you, for the little ago the German scholars have improved Greek so much. Then there's the future. Just think, one might invest all one's money, leave it to accumulated interest, hurry on ahead. To discover a society, erected on a strictly communistic basis, said I. Of all the wild, extravagant theories. Yes, it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until... Yes, so it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until... Experimental verification. You're going to verify that? The experiment. Let's see your experiment anyhow, though it's all humbug, you know. The time traveler smiled round at us, then, still smiling faintly, with his hands deep in his trousers pockets, he walked slowly out of the room, and we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his library, or his laboratory. I wonder what he's got. Oh, some sleight of hand trick or another. And Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he'd seen at Burslem, but before he'd finished his preface, the time traveler came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed under its own weight. Chapter 2. The Machine. The thing the traveler held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework, scarcely larger than a small clock and very delicately made. There was ivory in it and some transparent crystalline substance. And now I must be explicit, for this that follows, unless his explanation to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. He took one of the small octagonal tables that were scattered about the room and set it in front of the fire with two legs on the hearth rug. On this table he placed the mechanism, and he drew up a chair. Oh, excuse me. Thought I had handled all those. And then he drew up a chair and sat down. The only other object on the table was a small shaded lamp, the bright light of which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles about, two in brass candlesticks upon the mantel, and several in sconces, so the room was brilliantly illuminated. I sat in a low armchair nearest the fire, and I drew this forward so as to be almost between the traveler and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him, looking over his shoulder. The medical man, the provincial mayor, they watched him in profile from the right, and the psychologist from the left. The very young man stood behind the psychologist. We were all on alert. It appears incredible to me that any kind of trick, however subtly conceived and however adroitly done, could have been played upon us in these conditions. The time traveler looked at us and then at the mechanism. "Well, this little affair," said the time traveler, resting his elbows upon the table and pressing his hands together above the apparatus, "is only a model. It is my plan for a machine to travel through time. You'll notice that it looks singularly askew. There's an odd twinkling appearance about this bar, as though it was in some way unreal." He pointed to the part with his finger. "Also, here is one little white lever, and here is another." The medical man got up out of his chair and peered into the thing. "It's beautifully made. It took 2 years to make." Then, when we'd all imitated the action of the medical man to look closer, he said, "Now I want you clearly to understand that this lever, being pressed over, sends the machine gliding into the future, and the other reverses the motion. The saddle represents the seat of a time traveler. Presently I'm going to press the lever, and off the machine will go. It will vanish, pass into future time, and disappear. Have a good look at the thing. Look at the table, too, and satisfy yourselves there's no trickery. I don't want to waste this model and be told I'm a quack." There was a minute's pause, perhaps. The psychologist seemed about to speak to me, but changed his mind. Then the time traveler put forth his finger toward the lever. "No, lend me your hand." And turning to the psychologist, he took that individual's hand in his own and told him to put out his forefinger, so that it was the psychologist himself who sent forth the model time machine on its interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn. I'm absolutely certain there were no trickery. There was a breath of wind, the lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung round, became indistinct, was seen as a ghost for a second perhaps, as an eddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory, and it was gone, vanished. Save for the lamp, the table was bare. Everyone was silent for a minute. Philby said he was damned. The psychologist recovered from his stupor and suddenly looked under the table. At that, the time traveler laughed cheerfully. "Well," he said, with a reminiscence of the psychologist. Then, getting up, he went to the tobacco jar on the mantel, and with his back to us began to fill his pipe. We stared at each other. "Look here, are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that that machine's traveling in time?" "Certainly," said the time traveler, stopping to light a spill at the fire. Or stooping to light a spill at the fire, rather. Then he turned, lighting his pipe, to look at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show that he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it uncut. "What's more, I have a big machine, nearly finished in there," he indicated his laboratory, "and when that is put together I mean to have a journey on my own account." "You mean to say that that machine is traveling into the future?" "Into the future or the past, I don't know for certain. How? I don't for certain know which way it's gone." After an interval, the psychologist had an inspiration. "It must have gone to the past if it's gone anywhere." "Why's that?" Because I presume it has not moved in space, and if it traveled into the future, it'd still be here all this time, since it's traveled through this time. But if it traveled into the past, it would have been visible when we came first in the room, and last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, so on and so forth. Those are some serious objections, remarked the provincial mayor with an air of impartiality, turning toward the time traveler. Not a bit, said the traveler, and to the psychologist, you think you can explain that? It's presentation below the threshold, diluted presentation. Oh, of course, said the psychologist, and reassured us. That's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's plain enough, and helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see it, nor can we appreciate this machine any more than we can the spoke of a wheel spinning or a bullet flying through the air. If it's traveling through time 50 times or 100 times faster than we are, if it gets through a minute while we get through a second, the impression that it creates will be only 1/50th or 1/100th of what it would make if it were not traveling in time. That makes sense. He passed his hand through the space in which the machine had been. You see? He said and laughed. We sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so. Then the time traveler asked us what we thought of it all. Well, it sounds plausible enough tonight, but wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning. Would you like to see the time machine itself? Asked the traveler, and therewith, taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, draughty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer broad head in the silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how there in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism we'd seen vanish from before our eyes. Parts were of nickel, parts of ivory, parts had certainly been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench, beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz, it seemed to be. Look here, are you perfectly serious, or is this a trick like that ghost you showed us last Christmas? Upon that machine, said the time traveler, holding the lamp aloft, I intend to explore time. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life about it. None of us quite knew how to take it. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man, and he winked at me, solemnly. Chapter 3. The Time Traveler Returns. I think that at that time none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time traveler was one of those men who were always all too clever to be believed. You never felt you saw all round him. You suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush behind his lucid frankness. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter in the time traveler's words, we would have shown him much less skepticism, for we would have perceived his motives. A pork butcher could understand Philby, but the time traveler had more than a touch of whim among his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the fame of a less clever man seem tricks in his hands. It's a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never quite felt sure of his deportment. They were always somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I don't think that any of us said very much about time traveling in the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most of our minds. Its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anachronism and of utter confusion it suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model. Then I remember discussing with the medical man who I met on Friday at the Linnaean. He said that he'd seen a similar thing at Tübingen, and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle, but how the trick was done he could not explain. The next Thursday I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveler's most constant guests, and arriving late, found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked round for the time traveler and said, I looked round for the time traveler and, well, it's 7:30 now, said the medical man. Suppose we'd better have dinner? Where's... said I, naming the host. You've just come. It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. He asks me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes by. Well, it seems a pity to let the dinner spoil, said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and thereupon the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only other person besides the doctor and myself who'd attended the previous dinner. The other men were blank, the editor aforementioned. A certain journalist and another, a quiet, shy man with a beard who I didn't know and who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveler's absence, and I suggested time traveling in a jocular spirit. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick we'd witnessed that day's week. He was in the midst of this exposition when from the corridor, he was in the midst of this expedition. I can read English. He was in the midst of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened slowly and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. Hello there, at last! And the door opened wider, the time traveler standing before us. I gave a cry of surprise. Good heavens, man, what's the matter? Cried the medical man who saw him next, and the whole tableful turned toward the door. He was in amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty. He was smeared with green down the sleeves. His hair was disordered, and as it seemed to me, grayer, either with dust or dirt, or because its color had actually faded. His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, a half-healed cut. His expression was haggard and drawn, as if by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with such a limp as I have seen in footsore tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him not to speak. Uh, expecting him to speak, rather. That's where we were. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion toward the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it toward him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked round the table, and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. What on earth have you been up to, man? Said the doctor, and the time traveler didn't seem to hear. Well, don't let me disturb you, he said with a certain faltering articulation. I'm all right. He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. A draught? That's good. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint color came into his cheeks. His glance flickered over our faces with a certain dull approval, then went round the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again, still as it were, feeling his way among his words. I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat. He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. Tell you presently, said the traveler. I'm funny. I'll be all right in a minute. He put down his glass and walked toward the staircase door. Again I remarked upon his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall, and standing up in my place I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. And the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute, perhaps, my mind was wool-gathering. Then remarkable behavior of an eminent scientist. Then remarkable behavior of the eminent scientist. I heard the editor say, thinking after his wont in headlines. and this brought my attention back to the bright dinner table. What's the game? Has he been doing the amateur catcher? I don't know. Met the eye of the psychologist and read my own interpretation in his face. I thought of the time traveler limping painfully upstairs. I don't think anyone else had noticed his lameness. Ugh. Next time we reach a chapter, uh, I might turn off the camera and stand, see if it can get me to be a little less dozy. As noted up top, I'm a little tired. As much as I love this book, I've had one heck of a week at work, and so I am rather sleepy. The first to recover completely from the surprise was the medical man who rang the bell. The time traveler hated to have servants waiting at dinner for a hot plate. At that, the editor turned to his knife and fork with a grunt, and the silent man followed suit. Dinner resumed, and conversation was exclamatory for a little while, with gasps of wonderment. Then the editor got fervent in his curiosity. Does our friend eke out his modest income with a crossing, or has he his Nebuchadnezzar faces? I feel assured that it's this business of the time. I feel assured it's this business of the time machine, I said, and took up the psychologist's account of our previous meeting. The new guests were frankly incredulous, and the editor raised objections. What was this time traveling? Man couldn't cover himself with dust by rolling in a paradox, could he? Then, as the idea had come home to him, he resorted to caricature. Hadn't they any clothes brushes in the future? The journalist, too, would not believe at any price, and joined the editor in the easy work of heaping ridicule on the whole thing. They were both the new kind of journalists, very joyous, very irreverent young men. Our special correspondent of the day after tomorrow reports, the journalist was saying, or rather shouting, when the time traveler came back. He was dressed in ordinary evening clothes, and nothing save his haggard look reminded of the change that had startled me. I say, these chaps say you've been traveling in the middle next week. Tell us all about little Roseberry, will you? What will you take for the lot? The time traveler came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly, in his old way. Where's my mutton? What a treat it is to stick a fork into meat again. Story be damned. I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some peptone into my arteries. Thank you. The salt as well. One word. Have you been time traveling? Yes, said the time traveler with his mouth full, nodding his head. I'd give a shilling a line for a verbatim note, said the editor. The time traveler pushed his glass toward the silent man and rang it with his fingernail. At which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively, and poured him wine. The rest of the dinner was comfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept on rising to my lips, but I dare say it was the same with the others. The rest of the dinner. For my own part, sudden questions kept on rising to my lips, and I dare say it was the same with the others. The journalist tried to relieve the tension by telling anecdotes of Hetty Potter. The time traveler devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the time traveler through his eyelashes. The silent man seemed even more clumsy than usual, and drank champagne with regularity and determination out of sheer nervousness. At last the time traveler pushed his plate away and looked round us. I suppose I must apologize. I was simply starving. Suppose I must apologize. I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time. He reached out his hand for a cigar and cut the end. Come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates. And ringing the bell and passing, he led the way into the adjoining room. He led the way into the adjoining room. You have told blank, dash, and chose about the machine, he said to me, leaning back in his easy chair and naming the three new guests. Thing's a mere paradox, said the editor. I can't argue tonight. I don't mind telling you the story, but I can't argue. I will, however, tell you the story of what has happened happened to me, if you like. But you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it badly. Most of it will sound like lying, so be it true. Most of it'll sound like lying. So be it. It's true, every word of it, all the same. I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock, and since then I've lived 8 days. Such days as no human beings ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out, but I shan't sleep till I hold this thing over to you. Then I shall go to bed. No interruptions. But no interruptions. Is it agreed? Hmm. Agreed, said the editor, and the rest of us echoed the same. And with that, the time traveler began his story as I've set it forth. He sat back in his chair at first and spoke like a wearied man. Afterwards, he got more animated. In writing it down, I feel with only too much keenness the inadequacy of pen and ink, and above all, my own inadequacy to express its quality. You read, I will suppose, attentively enough, but you cannot see the speaker's white, sincere face in the bright circle of the little lamp, nor hear the intonation of his voice. You do not know his expression, follow the turns of his story. Many of us hearers were in shadow, for the candles on the smoking room had been lighted, and only the face of the journalist and the legs of the silent man from the knees downward were illuminated. At first we glanced now and again at the other. After a few times we ceased to do that, and looked only at the time traveler's face. Isn't it interesting? It opens with this like kind of setup scene, which I'd say not a lot of these adaptations use, but also I haven't seen a lot of adaptation, like straight adaptations of the Time Machine. There are plenty of other time travel stories I've seen, but not adaptations of the Time Machine in particular. Okay, I need to get up and get more water. I'm actually already out of water. See how you don't hear anything when I did that? It's because I don't have any water. I'm already out of water, and clearly I need to get up and wander around for a bit. So we'll be right back, just like the audio says. Uh, yeah, just we'll be right back. Now's a great time to grab water. I know we're not at intermission yet. We're nowhere near intermission, but now's a great time to grab water anyway. folks. I have gotten up, I've stretched a little bit to try and wake myself up. That yawn is not a good sign. Oh. I got at least a few more chapters in me, but this might be a short one. Luckily, this book, as I recall it, is relatively short. But I also haven't read it in years, so I may be mistaken. Oh, well, for 10, 10, 6, 16 chapters in total. Okay, yeah. Oh, man. I, my back muscles are not very happy with me. You know how when you sit in a desk chair for a little too long, no matter if it's a very nice desk chair or not, you can feel the weight of your spine a little bit. That's what's happening right now. And I love this book. I really do. It's actually a childhood favorite of mine. I'll freely admit I initially read it because it was, mentioned in Back to the Future Part 2. Or wait, no, Part 3. Because 2's the one where they go to the future, and 3's the one where they go to the westerns. And I've always preferred Part 2, but the love story in 3 really has grown on me as I've gotten older. And, as a kid, they were like, oh yeah, they mentioned Jules Verne, and they mentioned H.G. Wells' Time Machine, right? And, obviously, uh, Doc knows this story, and he mentions it. And I was like, huh, I've never heard of these, because I was a little middle of nowhere lad. Well, middle edge of nowhere is probably more accurate. Little edge of nowhere lad, and I hadn't heard of a lot of things, and so I heard about them in this movie, and I went, huh, I should read these. And lo and behold, what do I find on my grandparents' bookshelf? But a collection of various stories. One of them included is The Time Machine, and so I've read it many, many times, and it's been a personal favorite. Even after I read it as a little kid, initially, in high school, I found out about Project Gutenberg through another book I was reading. Actually, really good book. That's given me an idea. I wonder if that author will be open to author permission, because I'd love to read that. It's fascinating. It's a science fiction novel, kind of deals with the concepts of cellular automata consciousness, and what is nature versus nurture, and what is the value of using uh, certain assistive devices if they do not have the intended effect, etc., etc. It's really great. It's a fun, like, kind of middling high concept science fiction novel. I really enjoy it, and I should reach out to the author. I have a lot of books I should reach out to the author about, actually. If I open my while I'm distracted, I might as well continue rattling on, because it's making me wake up a little bit, I think. Um Actually, that also reminds me. You think the Francis Poulenc music would get me dinged? Yeah, because I have a vinyl recording from Poulenc. Poulenc being a composer of music, he kind of composes what was at the time kind of avant-garde, and now we kind of look at it and go, "That's avant-garde," uh, which it is kind of weird, in its own little way, but it's not like capital A, capital V, or capital A, capital G avant-garde, but it's a little weird. Um, The choir director I learned these pieces under, affectionately called Poulenc a rascal, and I think of it every time I hear the guy's music. So, uh, I just like saw those hiding in my file stores, and I was like, I wonder if those will get me copyright stricken. That's testing I need to do on my own. But anyway, I have a lot of books in here that I really should go asking authors about. Um, for example, Joe Haldeman. Joe Halderman wrote a really good one. I'm just gonna name authors, and I'm not gonna name names, and you all get to play the fun game of guess the books. Um, do I want to read that? Is this the one I think it is? I don't think it is. What's that? Oh, that one's not mine. Yeah, these a goodly chunk of my ebook library is based on the Kindle library that I've had previously, but I was not the only one tied to that Amazon account. Ewan Colfer actually be another really good one for me to ask about. Good books. What else? We've got Astounding Stories there. We know we can read those. Ooh, Michael Carroll actually be another really good one to ask. Ooh, Travis Bagwell might be good. Depending on if I have all of those. Those were really good, and they made me want to go play Dot Dungeon. That's another hint that I shouldn't have given you. What else? Obviously, Rick Riordan would be fun, but like with the Disney show coming up, I doubt he'd be down to play ball there. Let's see. What else would be fun? See, now I'm just like getting immediately distracted, digging through my books. The Herbert estate is not going to play ball. I'm never gonna read Dune. Like, let's be real. As much as I'd love to. Is Ted Decker the one I think it is? I want to open it, but then you would all see it. Um, S.A. Bodine has a few that would be really fun. Is Pete Larson the one I think it is? No, it's not. You know, I went to high school with this author. I don't know that she'd be willing to play ball just because she wrote at a very young age and self-published, but I went to high school with her. She might be down. Uh, she might be down to let me read it. Who knows? Um, Another one in here somewhere that's really good that I wanted to do. That's gonna be down in the W's. Let me go look at that author. The high concept novel I was talking about earlier, Robert J. Sawyer, be a really good author to ask about. What's the other one? Oh, Scott Westerfield. Scott Westerfield has a good few of them that I'd love to read on here. Neil Schusterman actually wouldn't be half bad of an author to ask about. Oh, there it is. Marion G. Harmon. Very fascinating take on a genre that I read a lot of already. Would be really fun. Daryl Pitt would be another great author to ask about. Sorry, I'm just like thinking aloud at this point instead of reading. Local man easily distracted on his own podcast? No. No, it can't be. Impossible. I definitely am not easily distracted in my own home. No. Michael Carroll would be another good author to ask, depending on if that's the book I think it is. Uh, mm, B.V. Larson wrote that one yet. That's not the book I thought it was, but maybe. Ooh, Scott Meyer. I don't know if Scott Meyer would be willing to play ball on that series. I only really want to read the first couple of them because I only read the first couple of them, but they're good. Like I said, Ewan Colfer would be another really good one to ask. Scott Westerfield would be really good. I have a few more in here that I'd really love to read. There's also just a bunch of like there's a bunch of stuff in here that I'm like I would adore to read, but it would not happen. There's a good several in here that just there ain't no way. There's a good few more in here that I actually actively have planned, and I'm looking at these and I'm like, oh man, I can't wait to get to that. Um, no, that's not the book I thought it was. Sorry. We already did that one. Sorry, you can't see the books I'm looking at, so this is just me listing authors and hemming and hawing. I already said Scott Meyer. Uh, that one would be fun. I don't know if we could get a hold of them because it's a pen name. Anyway, I've gotten thoroughly distracted, but I think I'm a little more awake for thinking about it. Joe Halderman, I think I already mentioned him. He's done a couple of books that I'd really love to read. K.A. Applegate, another one I'd really love to read. Applegate might actually be on board from what I've heard. There was like one more in here. There was one more in here that I was thinking about, and I'm like, oh man, I should really ask that author. You know what it is? I don't have the book, but it's I read the short story version of the book, and I have been meaning to ask the author about it for forever. It's kind of a solar punk type thing, and it looks really good. I already said S.A. Bodine. S.A. Bodine's written some really good stuff too. Uh, Anyway, I think I have to. Ooh, Robert J. Sawyer. Oh, that would be good. Some of these books should very much actively have covers as I'm looking at them and they don't have covers, which I'm a little confused about. Like, I guess the tool that I use to get them where I have them might have scrubbed the covers off of them, which isn't the end of the world, they're just book covers, but, meh, meh. But I digress. I digress a great deal, even. Is there? I feel like there's one more. Is this what I think it is? Oh no, that's one we could read actually. Okay, yeah, I've looked at all my books. Sorry, easily distracted, shocking no one. Let's take a little sip of water now that we've gotten the blood flow occurring, and actually get to some time traveling, shall we? Oh, Chapter 4, Time Traveling. I told some of you last Thursday the principles of the time machine and showed you the actual thing itself, incomplete in the workshop. There it is now, a little travel worn, truly. One of the ivory bars has cracked, a brass rail's bent, but the rest of it's sound enough. I expected to finish it on Friday, but on Friday, when putting together was nearly done, I found that one of the nickel bars was exactly 1 inch too short. This I had to get remade, so that the thing was not complete until this morning. It was 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next as that I felt then. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping one in the other, pressed the first and almost immediately the second. I seemed to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, and looking round I saw the laboratory exactly as before. And anything happened. For a moment I suspected my intellect had tricked me. Then I noted the clock. A moment before, as it had seemed, it stood at a minute or so past 10. It was now nearly half-past 3. Hi, Raz. Happy to have you around. Raz, showing off my favorite subscriber emotes so far. The lovely little emotes that she drew for us. A little Magnus and a little library. Which library is so comfy on the bed next to me. I do not think I can disturb him to try and get him on camera. I'll post a picture at BRB so you can come into the Discord and enjoy things there. But I appreciate your lyric, Raz, and everything You do around here. Uh, anyway, he had just jumped forward in time 5 hours, I believe. I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Miss Watchett came in and walked, apparently without seeing me, toward the garden door. I suppose it took her a minute or so to traverse the place, but to me she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position. The night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came another tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter and ever fainter. Tomorrow night came black, then day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind. I'm afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. They're excessively unpleasant. There's a feeling exactly like that one has upon a switchback. A helpless, headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an imminent crash. As I put on pace, night followed day like flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me. I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping at every minute darkening a day. I suppose the laboratory had been destroyed, and I'd come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things. The slowest snail that ever crawled, the slowest snail that ever crawled, dashed by too fast for me. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to my eye. Then, in the intermittent darknesses, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters, from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, I still gained velocity, the palpitations of night and day merging into a continuous grayness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous color like that of early twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space. The moon a fainter, fluctuating band. I could see nothing of the stars, save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still upon the hillside upon which this house stands now. The shoulder rose above me, grey and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapor, now brown, now green. They grew, spread, shivered, and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up, faint and fair, pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed changed, melting and flowing under my eyes. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed raced round faster and faster. Presently I noticed the sun belt swayed up and down from solstice to solstice in a minute or less, and that consequently my pace was over a year a minute. Minute by minute the white snow flashed across the world and vanished, was followed by the bright green of spring. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged at last into a sort of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked, indeed, a clumsy swaying of the machine, for which I was unable to account, but my mind was too confused to attend to it, so with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. At first I scarce thought of stopping, scarce thought of anything but these new sensations, but presently a fresh series of impressions drew up in my mind, a certain curiosity, and therewith a certain dread, until at last they took complete possession of me. What strange developments of humanity, what wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization, I thought, might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim, elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time, and yet, as it seemed, built of glimmer and mist. I saw a richer green flow up the hillside and remain there without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair, and so my mind came round to the business of stopping. Everybody welcome occasional guest host, guest star even, Magnus Cat. Everybody feel free to spam your little Magnus emotes. He is here. There he is. And hopefully he will stick around as we continue to read. Peculiar risk lay in the possibility of finding some substance in the space which I or the machine occupied, So long as I was traveling at such a high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered. I was, so to speak, attenuated, was slipping like a vapor through the interstices of intervening substances, but to come to a stop involved the jamming of myself molecule by molecule into whatever lay in my way, meant bringing my atoms into such intimate contact with those of the obstacle that a profound chemical reaction, possibly a far-reaching explosion, would result, and blow myself and my apparatus out of all possible dimensions into the unknown. This possibility had occurred to me again and again while making the machine, but then I had cheerfully accepted it as an unavoidable risk. Yeah, thank you for your input. Uh, Unavoidable risk, one of the risks a man's got to take. Well, now that the risk was inevitable, I no longer saw it in such a same cheerful light. Fact is that insensibly the absolute strangeness of everything, the sickly jarring and swaying of the machine, above all, the feeling of that prolonged fall had absolutely upset my nerves. I told myself I could never stop. With a gust of petulance I resolved to stop forthwith. Like an impatient fool, I tugged over the lever, and incontinently the thing went reeling over. I was flung headlong through the air. There was a sound of a clap of thunder in my ears. Might have been stunned for a moment. A pitiless hail was hissing round me. I was sitting on soft turf in front of the overset machine. Everything still seemed grey, but presently I remarked the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked round me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in a garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes. I noticed that their mauve and purple blossoms were dropping in a shower under the beating of the hailstones. The rebounding, dancing hail hung in a little cloud over the machine and drove along the ground like a smoke. In moments I was wet to the skin. Fine hospitality, said I to a man who has travelled innumerable years to see you. Presently I thought what a fool I was to get wet. I stood up and looked round me. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly beyond the rhododendrons throughout that hazy downpour, but all else of the world was invisible. My sensations, they were hard to describe. The columns of hail growing thinner, I saw the white figure more distinctly. It was very large, for a silver birch tree touched its shoulder. It was of white marble, in shape something like a winged sphinx, but the wings, instead of being carried vertically at the sides, were spread so that it seemed to hover. The pedestal, it appeared to me, was of bronze, was thick with verdigris. It chanced that the face was toward me. The sightless eyes seemed to watch me, the faint shadow of a smile on its lips. It was greatly weather-worn, that imparted a pleasant suggestion of disease, or an unpleasant suggestion of disease, rather. I stood looking at it for a little space, half a minute perhaps, or half an hour at most. It seemed to advance and to recede as the hail drove before it, denser or thinner. At last I tore my eyes from it for a moment, and saw the hail curtain had worn threadbare, and the sky was lightening again with the promise of the sun. For a little space absolutely counts for our little drinking game. Everybody take a sip of water. Friendly reminder, the words for the drinking game are tumult, zenith, for a space, terrible, and peculiar. I've also been digging to see if any other authors have such particular favorite words, and I have yet to find any lists. I might have to do the data work myself, to be honest. Just kind of, because I know, for example, while I'm distracted, for example, I can open Gutenberg right now, you know. Oh, that's a hole in my shirt. That's not something on the shirt. So, right now, I can open Gutenberg.org, right? And I can say, I can search, I can do an advanced search just by author. So I could say Jules Verne. Uh, Even better, I could say Jules Verne in English. And I could just feed all of these in, and there's like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Oh, I didn't know Jules Verne did an Antarctic book. Hmm. Yeah, there's a good, several of these. There's a good like 25-ish in here. I would assume there's some duplicates, but you get my point. I could go in, I could pull all these books of Jules Verne's and run like some kind of statistical analysis and like filter out all of the standard common English words like prepositions like the and find his weird little favorite words. I might have to wind up doing that if I can't. I haven't had any luck finding it online. Or what's another good author that we read a lot of here? Um, we might wind up with what's his name? Oh, he did the extra day, and we were gonna dig farther on him. Oh man, I don't remember. Uh, Hang on. I know what I'll do. I'll look up the extra day. Very easily distracted today. Algernon Blackwood. We could find his favorite words, for example. Or like, you know, I'm sure Astounding Stories kind of has a very specific author thumbprint in it. Jesse F. Bone is another one that has come up a couple times, I think. Oh yeah, at least 3 times. That'd be another really good one. Also very good to pull, I think, would be Edgar Rice Burroughs. I'm sure that man has some very specific words he really loves because he did Tarzan and John Carter, and we're reading more John Carter eventually. So like pulling the information for him would be really nice too. Anyway, this man was looking at a statue and the hail was stopping. That's where we were. I looked up again at the crouching white shape. Yeah, I'm gonna divest with character voice for a minute because he's just narrating. I looked up again at the crouching white shape, and the full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What might appear when that hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn? What might not have happened to man? What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? What if in this interval the race lost its manliness and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, overwhelmingly powerful? I might seem some old world savage animal, only the more dreadful and disgusting for our common likeness, a foul creature to be incontinently slain. Tell it on yourself there, sir. Already I saw other vast shapes, huge buildings with intricate parapets and tall columns, a wooded hillside dimly creeping in upon me through the lessening storm. I was seized with a panic fear. I returned frantically to the time machine and strove hard to readjust it. As I did so, the shafts of sun smote through the thunderstorm. The grey downpour was swept aside and vanished like the trailing garments of a ghost. Above me, in the intense blue of a summer sky, some faint brown shreds of cloud whirled into nothingness. The great buildings about me stood out clear and distinct, shining with the wet of the thunderstorm, and picked out in white by the unmelted hailstones piled along their courses. I felt naked in a strange world. I felt as perhaps a bird may feel in the clear air, knowing the hawk wings above and will swoop at me. My fear grew to a frenzy. I took a breathing space, set my teeth, and again grappled fiercely, wrist and knee, with the machine. It gave under my desperate onset and turned over. It struck my chin violently on the way. One hand on the saddle, the other on the lever, I stood panting heavily in an attitude to mount again. But with this recovery of a prompt retreat, my courage recovered. I looked more curiously and less fearfully at this world of the remote future. In a circular opening high up in the wall of the nearer house, I saw a group of figures clad in rich, soft robes. They'd seen me, and their faces were directed toward me. Then I heard voices approaching me. Coming through the bushes by the white sphinx were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged in a pathway leading straight to the little lawn upon which I stood with my machine. He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic girdled at the waist with a leather belt. Sandals or buskins, I couldn't clearly distinguish which, were on his feet. His legs were bare to the knees, and his head was bare as well. Noticing that, I noted for the first time how warm the air had become. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful type of consumptive, that hectic beauty which we used to hear so much about. At the sight of him, I suddenly regained more confidence. I took my hands from the machine. Chapter 5. In the Golden Age. In another moment we were standing face to face, I and this fragile thing out of futurity. He came straight up to me and laughed into my eyes. The absence of his bearing, of any sign of fear, struck me at once. Then he turned to the 2 others who were following him, and spoke to them in a strange and very sweet and very liquid tongue. There were others coming, and presently a little group of perhaps 8 or 10 of these exquisite creatures were about me. One of them addressed me. It came into my head, oddly enough, that my voice was too harsh and too deep for them. So I shook my head, and pointing to my ears, shook it again. He came a step forward, hesitated, then touched my hand, and I felt other soft little tentacles upon my back and shoulders. They wanted to make sure I was real. There was nothing at all in this alarming, to be fair. Indeed, there was something else in these pretty little people that inspired confidence, a graceful gentleness, a certain childlike ease. And besides, they looked so frail that I could fancy myself flinging the whole dozen of them about like ninepins. But I made a sudden motion to warn them when I saw their little pink hands feeling of the time machine. Happily then, when it was not too late, I thought of a danger I had hitherto forgotten, and reaching over the bars of the machine, I unscrewed the little levers that would set it in motion, and put these in my pocket. I then turned again to see what I could do in the way of communication. And then looking more clearly into their features, I saw some further peculiarities in their Dresden china type of prettiness. Their hair, which was uniformly curly, came to a sharp end at the neck and cheek. There wasn't the faintest suggestion of it on their faces, and their ears were singularly minute. The mouths were small, with bright red, rather thin lips, and the little chins ran to a point. The eyes were large and mild, and, well, this may seem egotism on my part, I fancied that there was a certain lack of interest I might have expected in them. They made no effort to communicate with me, but simply stood around me, smiling and speaking in soft, cooing notes to each other. I began the conversation then. I pointed to the time machine and to myself, and then, hesitating for a moment how to express time, I pointed to the sun. At once a quaintly pretty little figure in checkered purple and white followed my gesture, and astonished me by imitating the sound of thunder. For a moment I was staggered, though the import of the gesture was plain enough. The question had come into my mind abruptly. Were these creatures fools? You may hardly understand how it took me. You see, I had always anticipated that the people of the year 800 and 2000 would be incredibly in front of us in knowledge, art, and everything. Then one of them suddenly asked me a question that showed him to be on the intellectual level of one of our 5-year-old children. Asked me, in fact, if I'd come from the sun in a thunderstorm. It let loose the judgment I'd suspended from their clothes, their frail, light limbs, and fragile features. A flow of disappointment rushed across my mind. For a moment I felt that I'd built the time machine in vain. I nodded, pointed to the sun, and gave them such a vivid rendering of a thunderclap that it startled them. They all withdrew a pace or so, and bowed. Then came one laughing toward me, carrying a chain of beautiful flowers altogether new to me, and put it about my neck. The idea was received with melodious applause. Presently they were all running to and fro for flowers, and laughingly flinging them upon me until I was almost smothered with the blossoms. You who have never seen the like can scarcely imagine what delicate and wonderful flowers countless years of culture had created. Then someone suggested their plaything should be exhibited in the nearest building, and so I was led past the Sphinx of white marble, which seemed to watch me all the while with a smile at my astonishment, towards a vast grey edifice of fretted stone. As I went with them, the memory of my confident anticipations of a profoundly grave and intellectual posterity came with irresistible merriment to my mind. The building had a huge entry, and was altogether of colossal dimensions. I was naturally most occupied with the growing crowd of little people, and with the big open portals that yawned before me, shadowy and mysterious. My general impression of the world I saw over their heads was a tangled waste of beautiful bushes and flowers, a long neglected and yet weedless garden. I saw a number of tall spikes of strange white flowers, measuring a foot perhaps across the spread of the waxen petals. They grew scattered as if they were wild among the variegated shrubs, but as I say, I did not examine them closely at this time. The time machine, for that matter, was left deserted on the turf among the rhododendrons. The arch of the doorway was richly carved, but naturally I didn't observe the carving very narrowly, though I fancied I saw suggestions of old Phoenician decorations as I passed through, and it struck me that they were very badly broken and weather-worn. Naturally, you didn't observe the carving very narrowly? I would be trying to observe everything. Like, he's like, oh, naturally, I didn't pay any attention to this. Naturally, I didn't pay any attention to that. I'm like, if I was, like, 800,000 years in the future, I think I'd be paying attention to literally everything I could get my hands on. But that's just me. Several more brightly clad people met me in the doorway, and so we entered, I dressed in dingy 19th century garments, looking grotesque enough, garlanded with flowers, and surrounded by an eddying mass of bright, soft-colored robes and shining white limbs in a melodious world of laughter and laughing speech. The big doorway opened into a proportionally great hall hung with browns. The roof was in shadow, and the windows, partially glazed with colored glass and partially unglazed, emitted a tempered light. The floor was made up of huge blocks of some very hard white metal, not plates nor slabs, blocks, and it was so much worn, as I judged by the going to and fro of past generations, as to be deeply channeled along the more frequented ways. Transverse to the length were innumerable tables made of slabs of polished stone, raised perhaps a foot from the floor, and upon these were heaps of fruit. Some I recognized as a sort of hypertrophied raspberry and orange, but for the most part they were strange. Between the tables was scattered a great number of cushions. Upon these my conductors seated themselves, signing for me to do likewise. With a pretty absence of ceremony, they began to eat the fruit with their hands, flinging peel and stalks and so forth into round openings in the sides of the table. I was not loath to follow their example. I felt thirsty and hungry, and as I did so, I surveyed the hall at my leisure. And perhaps the thing that struck me the most was its dilapidated look. The stained glass windows, which displayed only a geometrical pattern, were broken in many places. The curtains that hung across the lower end were thick with dust. It caught my eye that the corner of the marble table near me was fractured. Nevertheless, the general effect was extremely rich and picturesque. There were perhaps 100 people dining in the hall. Most of them, seated near as they could come, were watching me with interest, their little eyes shining over the fruit they were eating. All of them were clad in the same soft and strong silky material. The fruit, by the by, was all their diet. These people of the remote future were strict vegetarians, while I was with them in spite of some carnal cravings. I had to be frugivorous as well. Indeed, I found afterward that horses, cattle, sheep, dogs, they'd followed the ichthyosaur into extinction. But the fruits were delightful. One in particular that seemed to be in season all the time I was there. It was a flowery thing in a three-sided husk. It was especially good. I made it my staple. At first I was puzzled by all these strange fruits and by the strange flowers I saw, but later I began to perceive their import. However, I'm telling you of my fruit dinner in the distant future now. So soon as my appetite was a little checked, I determined to make a resolute attempt to learn the speech of these new men of mine. Clearly, that was the next thing to do. The fruits seemed a convenient thing to begin upon, and holding one of these up, I began a series of interrogative sounds and gestures. I had met some considerable difficulty in conveying my meaning. At first my efforts met with a stare of surprise or some inextinguishable laughter, but presently a fair-haired little creature seemed to grasp my intention and repeated a name. They had to chatter and explain the business at great length to each other, and my first attempts to make the exquisite little sounds of their language caused an immense amount of genuine, if uncivil, amusement. However, I felt like a schoolmaster amidst children, and persisted. Presently I had a score of noun substantives at least at my command, but then I got to demonstrative pronouns and even the verb to eat. Then it was slow work, though, and the little people soon tired and wanted to get away from my interrogations, so I determined, rather of necessity, to give them their lessons in little doses, or when they felt inclined to do so. In very little doses I found they were, before long, for I never met people more indolent or easily fatigued. Chapter 6. The Sunset of Mankind. A queer thing I soon discovered about my little hosts, and that was their lack of interest. They'd come to me with eager cries of astonishment, like children, but like children, they'd soon stop examining me and wander away after some other toy. The dinner and my conversational beginnings ended, I noted for the first time that almost all those who had surrounded me at first were gone. It's odd, too, how speedily I came to disregard these little people. I went out through the portal into the sunlit world again as soon as my hunger was satisfied. I was continually meeting more of these men of the future who would follow me a little distance, chatter and laugh about me, and having smiled and gesticulated in a friendly way, leave me again to my own devices. The calm of evening was upon the world as I emerged from the great hall, and the scene was lit by the warm glow of the setting sun. At first things were very confusing. Everything was so entirely different from the world I'd known, even the flowers. The big building I'd left was situated on the slope of a broad river valley, but the Thames had shifted, perhaps a mile from its present position. I resolved to mount the summit of a crest, perhaps a mile and a half away, from which I could get a wider view of this planet in this our year, the 802,701 A.D. For that I should explain was the date of the little dials that my machine recorded. As I walked, I was watching for every impression that could possibly help to explain the condition of ruinous splendor in which I found the world. Ruinous it was indeed. A little way up the hill, for instance, was a vast heap of granite, bound together by masses of aluminum, a vast labyrinth of precipitous walls and crumbled heaps, amidst which were thick heaps of beautiful pagoda-like plants, nettles, possibly, wonderfully tinted with brown about the leaves, incapable of stinging. It was evidently the derelict remains of some vast structure. To what end they built it I could not determine. It was here that I was destined, at a later date, to have a very strange experience, the first imitation of a still stranger discovery, or rather first intimation of a still stranger discovery, but that I will speak of in its proper place. Looking round with a sudden thought from a terrace on which I rested for a while, I realized that there were no small houses to be seen. Apparently the single house, and possibly even the household, had vanished. Here and there among the greenery were palace-like buildings, but for the house and the cottage which form such characteristic features of our own English landscape, they'd disappeared. Communism, I said to myself, and on the heels of that came another thought. I looked at the half-dozen little figures that were following me, then in a flash I perceived that all had the same form of costume, the same soft, hairless visage, and the same girlish rotundity of limb. It may seem strange, perhaps, that I had not noticed this before, but everything was so strange in its entirety. I saw the facts plainly enough now. In costume, and in all the differences of texture and bearing that now mark off the sexes from each other, these people of the future were alike, and the children seemed to my eyes to be but miniatures of their parents. I judged then that the children of that time were extremely precocious, physically at least, and I found afterwards abundant verification of my opinion. Seeing the ease and security in which these people were living, I felt that this close resemblance of the sexes was after all what one would expect. The strength of a man and the softness of a woman, the institution of family, the differentiation of occupations are mere militant necessities of an age of physical force. Where population is balanced and abundant, much childbearing becomes an evil rather than a blessing to the state. Where violence comes, but rarely, and offspring are secure, there's less necessity. Indeed, there's no necessity for an efficient family, and the specialization of the sexes with reference to their children's needs, it disappears. We see some beginnings of this even in our own time, and in this future age it was complete. This, I must remind you, was speculation at the time. Later I was to appreciate how far it fell short of the reality. While I was musing upon these things, my attention was attracted by a pretty little structure, like a well under a cupola. A cupola. I thought in a transitory way, the oddness of wells still existing, then resumed the thread of my speculations. There were no large buildings toward the top of that hill, and my walking powers were evidently miraculous, as I was presently left alone for the first time. With a strange sense of freedom and adventure, I pushed on up to the crest. There I found a seat of some yellow metal I didn't recognize, corroded in places with a pinkish rust and half smothered in soft moss, the armrests cast and filed into the resemblance of griffins' heads. I sat down on it and surveyed the broad view of our old world under the sunset of that long, long day. It was as sweet and fair a view as I've ever seen. The sun had already gone below the horizon, and the west was flaming gold, touched with some horizontal bars of purple and crimson. Below was the valley of the Thames, in which the river lay like a band of burnished steel. I've already spoken of some of the great palaces dotted about among the variegated greenery, some in ruins and some still occupied. Here and there rose a white or silvery figure in the waste garden of the earth. Here and there came the sharp vertical line of some cupola or obelisk. There were no hedges, no signs of proprietary rights, no evidences of agriculture. The whole earth had become a garden. And so watching, I began to put my interpretation upon the things I'd seen, and as it shaped itself to me that evening, my interpretation was something in this way. Of course, afterwards I found I'd only gotten half the truth, or perhaps just a glimpse of one facet of the truth. It seemed to me that I had happened upon humanity upon the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. For the first time I began to realize an odd consequence of the social effort in which we are at present engaged. And yet, come to think, it is a logical consequence enough. Strength is the outcome of need. Security sets a premium on feebleness. The work of ameliorating the conditions of life, the true civilizing process that makes life more and more secure, had gone on steadily to its climax. One triumph of united humanity over nature had followed another. Things that are now mere dreams had become projects deliberately put in hand and carried forward, and that harvest of all these things was what I saw. After all, the sanitation and agriculture of today are still in the rudimentary stage. The science of our time has attacked but a little department of the field of human disease, but even so it spreads its operations very steadily and persistently. Our agriculture and horticulture destroy a weed just here and there, cultivate perhaps a score or so of wholesome plants, leaving the greater number to fight out of balance as they can. We improve our favorite plants and animals, how few they are, gradually by selective breeding, and now a bigger and better peach, a seedless grape, a sweeter and larger flower, a more convenient breed of cattle even. We improve them gradually. Our ideals are vague and tentative, and our knowledge is very limited, because nature, too, is shy and slow in our clumsy hands. Some day all this will be better organized, and still better. This is the drift of the current in spite of the eddies. The whole world will be intelligent, educated, and cooperating. Things will move faster and faster toward the subjugation of nature. In the end, wisely and carefully, we shall readjust the balance of animal and vegetable life to suit our human needs. This adjustment, I say, must have been done, and done well besides, done indeed for all time, in the space of time across which my machine had leapt. The air was free from gnats, the earth from weeds or fungi. Everywhere were fruits and sweet delightful flowers. Brilliant butterflies flew hither and thither. The ideal of preventative medicine was attained. Diseases had been stamped out. I saw no evidence of any contagious diseases during all my stay, and I shall have to tell you later that Even the processes of putrefaction and decay had been profoundly affected by these changes. Social triumphs, too, had been affected. I saw mankind housed in splendid shelters, gloriously clothed, and as yet I had found them engaged in no toil. There were no signs of struggle, neither social nor economic struggle for that matter. The shop, the advertisement, traffic, all that commerce which constitutes the body of our world, it was gone. It was natural on that golden evening I should jump at the idea of a social paradise. The difficulty of increasing population had been met, I guessed, and population had ceased to increase. But with this change in condition comes inevitably adaptation to the change. What, unless biological science as a mass of errors, is the cause of human intelligence and vigor? Hardship, freedom, conditions under which the active, strong, and subtle survive, and the weaker go to the wall. Conditions that put a premium upon the loyal alliance of capable men, upon self-restraint, patience, and decision. And the institution of the family, the emotions that arise therein, the fierce jealousy, the tenderness for offspring, parental self-devotion, all found their justification and support in the imminent dangers of the young. But now, where are these imminent dangers? There's a sentiment arising. It'll grow against connubial jealousy, against fierce maternity, against passion of all sorts. Unnecessary things now. And things that make us uncomfortable, savage survivals, discords in a refined and pleasant life. I thought of the physical slightness of these people, their lack of intelligence, and those big abundant ruins. It strengthened my belief in a perfect conquest of nature. For after the battle comes quiet. Humanity had been strong, energetic, intelligent, had used all its abundant vitality to alter the conditions under which it lived, and now came the reaction of the altered conditions. Under the new conditions of perfect comfort and security, that restless energy that with us is strength would become a weakness. Even in our own time, certain tendencies and desires, once necessary to survive, are a constant source of failure. Physical courage and the love of battle, for instance, they're no great help in this day and age. They may even be hindrances to a civilized man. And in a state of physical balance and security, power, intellectual as well as physical, would be out of place. For countless years I judged there had been no danger of war, nor solitary violence, no danger from wild beasts, no wasting diseases that require strength of constitution, no need of toil at all. For such a life, what we would call the weak are as well equipped as the strong. They're no longer weak. Better equipped indeed they are for the strong that would be fretted by an energy that there was no outlet. No doubt the exquisite beauty of the buildings I saw was the outcome of the last surgings of the now purposeless energy of mankind before it settled down into perfect harmony with the conditions under which it lived. The flourish of that triumph which began the last great peace. This has ever been the fate of energy and security. It takes to art, to eroticism, and then come languor and decay afterward. Even this artistic impetus would at last die away, had almost died in the time I saw. To adorn themselves with flowers, to dance, to sing in the sunlight, so much was left of the artistic spirit, and no more. Even that would fade in the end into a contented inactivity. Were kept keen on the grindstone of pain and necessity, and it seemed to me that here was that hateful grindstone broken at last. As I stood there in the gathering dark, I thought that in this simple explanation I had mastered the problem of the world, mastered the whole secret of this delicious people. Possibly the checks they had devised for their increase of population had succeeded too well. The numbers had rather diminished than kept stationary. That would account for the abandoned ruins. Very simple was my explanation, and plausible enough. Well, as most wrong theories are. Alright, gang. There are 16 chapters in this book, and I think I'm gonna dive into chapter 7 here in a second. And depending on how I feel, we might try to tackle chapter 8. But either way, we'll be getting through chapter 7, and then we'll leave the other half of the book for next week meet. So let's get into chapter 7, A Sudden Shock. As I stood there, musing over this too perfect triumph of man, oh no, not the hiccups. Okay. As I stood there musing over this too perfect triumph of man, the full moon, yellow and gibbous, came up out of an overflow of silver light in the northeast. The bright little figures ceased to move about below, a noiseless owl flitted by, and I shivered with the chill of the night. I determined to descend and find where I could sleep. I looked for the building I knew. Then my eye travelled along to the figure of the white sphinx upon the pedestal of bronze, growing distinct as the light of the rising moon grew brighter. I could see the silver birch against it. There was a tangle of rhododendron bushes, black in the pale light, and there was the little lawn. I looked at the lawn again. A queer doubt chilled my complacency. No, I said stoutly to myself, that was not the lawn. But it was the lawn, for the white leprous face of the Sphinx was toward it. Can you imagine what I felt as the conviction came home to me? But you cannot. You don't know. The time machine was gone. At once, like a lash across the face, came the possibility of losing my own age, of being left helpless in this strange new world. The bare thought of it was an actual physical sensation. I could feel it grip me at the throat, stop my breathing. In another moment I was in a passion of fear and running with great leaping strides down the slope. Once I fell headlong and cut my face. I lost no time in staunching the blood, just jumped up and ran on with a warm trickle down my cheek and chin. All the time I ran I was saying to myself, they've moved it a little, pushed it out under the bushes out of the way. Nevertheless, I ran with all my might. All the time with a certainty that sometimes comes with excessive dread. I knew that such assurance was folly, knew instinctively that the machine was removed out of reach. My breath came with pain. I suppose I covered the whole distance from the hill crest to the little lawn, 2 miles perhaps, in 10 minutes. And I'm not a young man, mind. I cursed aloud as I ran, at my confident folly in leaving the machine wasting good breath thereby. I cried aloud, and no one answered. Not a creature seemed to be stirring in that moonlit world. When I reached the lawn, my worst fears were realized. Not a trace of the thing was to be seen. I felt faint and cold when I faced the empty space among the black tangle of bushes. I ran round it furiously, as if the thing might be hidden in a corner, then stopped abruptly with my hands clutching my hair. Above me towered the Sphinx upon the bronze pedestal, white, shining, leprous in the light of the rising moon. It seemed to smile in mockery of my dismay. I might have consoled myself by imagining the little people who put the mechanism in some shelter for me, had I not felt assured of their physical and intellectual inadequacy. This is what dismayed me, the sense of some hitherto unsuspected power through whose intervention my invention had vanished. Yet for one thing I felt assured. Unless some other age had produced its exact duplicate, the machine could not have been moved in time. The attachment of the levers, I'll show you the method later, prevented anyone from tampering with it in that way when they were removed. It had moved and had been hidden, mind, only in space, but where could it be? I think I must have had a kind of frenzy at it all. I remember running violently in and out along the moonlit bushes all round the Sphinx, startling some little white animal that in the dim light I took for a small deer. I remember, too, late that night, beating the bushes with my clenched fist until my knuckles were gashed and bleeding from the broken twigs. Then, sobbing and raving in my anguish of mind, I went down to the great building of stone. The big hall was dark, silent, and deserted. I slipped on the uneven floor and fell over one of the malachite tables, almost breaking my shin. I lit a match and went on past the dusty curtains, of which I had told you previously. There I found a second great hall covered with cushions, upon which perhaps a score or so of the little people were sleeping. I have no doubt they found my second appearance strange enough. Coming suddenly out of the quiet darkness with inarticulate noises and the sputter and flare of a match. For they had forgotten about matches by this time. "Where's my time machine?" I began, bawling like an angry child, laying hands upon them and shaking them up together. It must have been very queer to them. Some laughed, most of them looked sorely frightened. When I saw them standing round me, it came into my head that I was doing as foolish a thing as it was possible for me to do under the circumstances, in trying to revive the sensation of fear. For reasoning from their daylight behavior, I thought that fear must be forgotten. Abruptly, I dashed down the match, and knocking one of the people over in my course, went blundering across the big dining hall again, out under the moonlight. I heard cries of terror and their little feet running and stumbling this way and that. I do not remember all I did as that moon crept up the sky. I suppose it was the unexpected nature of my loss that maddened me. I felt hopelessly cut off from my own kind, a strange animal in an unknown world. I must have raved to and fro, screaming and crying upon God and fate. I have a memory of horrible fatigue, a long night of despair wearing away, of looking in this impossible place and that, groping among moonlit ruins and touching strange creatures in the black shadows, at last of even lying on the ground near the Sphinx and weeping with absolute wretchedness, even anger at the folly of leaving the machine having leaked away with my strength. I had nothing left for me but misery. Then I slept, and when I woke again it was a full day, a couple of sparrows hopping round me on the turf within reach of my arm. I sat up in the freshness of the morning, trying to remember how I'd gotten there, and why I had such a profound sense of desertion and despair. Then things came clear in my mind. With the plain, reasonable daylight, I could look my circumstances fairly in the face. I saw the wild folly of my frenzy overnight, and I could reason with myself. Suppose the worst. Suppose the machine to be altogether lost, perhaps destroyed. It behooves me to be calm and patient, to learn the way of the people, to get a clear idea of the method of my loss, and the means of getting materials and tools, so that, in the end, perhaps I may make another. That would be my only hope, a poor hope, perhaps, but better than despair. After all, it was a beautiful and curious world. But probably the machine had only been taken away. Still, I must be calm and patient, find its hiding place, and recover it by force or cunning, whichever worked best. With that, I scrambled to my feet and looked about me, wondering where I could bathe. I felt weary, stiff, and travel-soiled. The freshness of the morning made me desire an equal freshness. I had exhausted my own emotions. Indeed, as I went about my business, I found myself wondering at my intense excitement overnight. I made a careful examination of the ground about the little lawn. I wasted some time in futile questionings, conveyed, as well as I was able, to such of the little people that came by. They all failed to understand my gestures. Some were simply stolid, some thought it was a jest, and laughed at me. I had the hardest task in the world to keep my hands off their pretty laughing faces. It was a foolish impulse, but the devil begotten of fear and blind anger was ill-curbed and still eager to take advantage of my perplexity. The turf gave better counsel. I found a groove ripped in it about midway between the pedestal of the Sphinx and the marks of my feet where, on arrival, I had struggled with the overturned machine. There were other signs of removal about, a queer narrow footprint like those I could imagine made by sloths. This directed my closer attention to the pedestal. It was, as I think I've said, of bronze. It wasn't a mere block, but highly decorated with deep-framed panels on either side. I went and rapped at these. The pedestal was hollow. Examining the panels with care, I found them discontinuous with the frames. There were no handles nor keyholes, but possibly the panels, if they were doors, as I supposed they were, opened from within. One thing was clear enough to my mind, however. It took no very great mental effort to infer that my time machine was inside the pedestal. How it got in there, well, that was the different problem. I saw the heads of two orange-clad people coming through the bushes and under some blossom-covered apple trees toward me. I turned smiling to them and beckoned them to me. They came, and then, pointing to the bronze pedestal, I tried to intimate my wish to open it. But at my first gesture toward this, they behaved very oddly. I don't know how to convey their expression to you. Suppose you were to use a grossly improper gesture to a delicate-minded woman. That might be how she'd look. They went off as if they'd received they went off as if they had received the last possible insult. I tried a sweet-looking chap in white next with the exact same result. Somehow his manner made me feel ashamed of myself, but, I wanted the time machine, and I tried him once more. As he turned off like the others, my temper got the better of me. In 3 strides I was after him, had him by the loose part of his robe round the neck, and then began dragging him toward the Sphinx. Then I saw the horror and repugnance of his face, and all of a sudden I couldn't let him go. But I was not beaten yet. I banged with my fists at the bronze panels, but I heard something stir inside. To be explicit, I thought I heard a a chuckle. But I must have been mistaken. Then I got a big pebble from the river and came and hammered it till I had flattened a coil in the decorations, and the verdigris came off in powdery flakes. The delicate little people must have heard me hammering in gusty outbreaks a mile away on the other hand, but nothing came of it. I saw a crowd of them upon the slopes looking furtively at me. At last, hot and tired, I sat down to watch the place, but I was too restless to watch long. Too occidental for a long vigil. I could work at a problem for years, but to remain inactive and wait for 24 hours, well, that's another matter. I got up after a time and began walking aimlessly through the bushes toward the hill again. Patience, I said to myself. If you want your machine again, you must leave that Sphinx alone. If they mean to take your machine away, it's good that you're wrecking their bronze panels. Or it's little good that you're wrecking their bronze panels. And if they don't, you'll get it back as soon as you can ask for it. To sit among all those unknown things before a puzzle like that is hopeless. That way lies monomania. Face this world, learn its ways, watch it. Be careful, too, of hasty guesses at its meaning. In the end, you'll find clues to it all. Then suddenly the humor of the situation came into my mind, the thought of the years I'd spent in study and toil to get into the future age, and now my passion of anxiety to get out of it. I'd made myself the most complicated and most hopeless trap that a man had ever devised. Although it was at my own expense, I couldn't help myself. I laughed aloud. Going through the big palace, it seemed to me that the little people avoided me. Might have been my fancy, or it might have had something to do with my hammering at the gates of bronze. Yet I felt tolerably sure of the avoidance. I was careful, however, to show no concern and to abstain from any pursuit of them. In the course of a day or two, things got back to the old footing. I made what progress I could in the language, and in addition I pushed my explorations here and there. Either I missed some subtle point, or their language was excessively simple, almost exclusively composed of concrete substantives and verbs. There seemed to be few, if any, abstract terms, or little use of figurative language. Their sentences were usually simple, and of 2 words I failed to convey or understand any but the simplest prepositions. I determined to put the thought of my time machine and the mystery of the bronze doors under the Sphinx as much as possible into a corner of my memory, until my growing knowledge would lead me back to them in a natural way. Yet a certain feeling, you may understand, tethered me in a circle of a few miles around the point of my arrival. Okay, folks, I am very sleepy. We're going to call it a little shorter than the last couple episodes, but thankfully the Time Machine is a little bit of a shorter book, and so we should have a good shot of finishing this next week. If not, we'll probably have some short stories in store for us week after next. But either way, we'll cross those bridges when we get there. Um, Let me promote all my things now. Let me tell you about all the things I've been doing. I have been posting a single TikTok a day over on TikTok. Occasionally I'll interact with a trend or something, but if you want little bite-sized bits of the stream, I've been posting them on TikTok, and I've also been cross-posting those TikToks to my YouTube channel as shorts. What else have I been doing? Obviously, this is a podcast. The Paper Cuts podcast. If you want more of this, there is an entire 60 episode first season in which we dive into various stories. And we are now coming up on episode 45 of season 2. I believe this is episode 45 of season 2, if I've kept count correctly. We'll probably. I have some thoughts in the back of my head about seasoning further, but needless to say, there's a lot more if you like what you're hearing now. We've done a good few other H.G. Wells books. We've also done a good few Jules Verne books, a contemporary of H.G. Wells. We did the January through July issues of Astounding Stories. There's plenty around. Basically, as you're scrolling through the podcast feed, each episode that is simply titled the book's title, that's the first episode from there, and then it keeps going. Of particular interest to me, I believe, is Dracula. I put a lot of it more work into editing those than usual, and I hope it shows. What else have I been doing? I said YouTube, I said Twitch. Obviously, we're actively streaming on Twitch. That's what I had forgotten. Tuesday nights we play games. Right now we are very thoroughly in the middle of playing Control. I've been enjoying it a great deal. And once we've finished Control, I have some solo tabletop RPGs I'm going to come back to playing. We were on a real solo tabletop RPG kick for a while there, and it was a great time, and we'll be coming back to it once we finish Control. Next week we'll be finishing up this book, likely. Next week on Friday, I mean. Okay, I said Twitch, I said YouTube, I said TikTok, I mentioned the podcast. Because we didn't have really a traditional intermission this week, I forgot to mention Codex. There's a little bug above my head. It's my Twitch team down below me. It's a group of fellow reading streamers like myself. It doesn't look like any of them are streaming right now, but usually if one of them's streaming, we go say hi. We kind of run the gamut on genres. There's a lot of us, and I think if you even slightly like what I do, you will like someone else in the Codex, I'm sure. They do monthly book clubs. This month's book club is coming up in a couple days. They're going to be doing a Jane Austen novel. I don't recall which one off the top of my head. I don't know if we have plans for March. I certainly have some ideas that I've been meaning to pitch in regards to March. Honestly, this is just me workshopping live on stream. The book we did a while back, The 5 Jars. That would be a really good March one. I think it kind of deals with the fair folk, and feels very Irish to me. They run into some leprechaun types, but that's just a thought. I might run that past the Codex gang. Anyway, we do book clubs once a month, ideally. Whether I can show up depends entirely on when they're scheduled, but they happen. I think that's all my things. I think I've promoted the Twitch team. YouTube, Twitch, TikTok, podcast. I feel like I'm missing one thing. I've already mentioned it tonight, but the Discord. I have a Discord. I have been posting a lot more custom content that doesn't go anywhere else there. If you want to yell books at me to read, drop by. If you want to see the bread I'm baking once a week, if you want to see the way that I'm working on digitizing some analog media if you want to see interesting views from my time out on the road, because, surprise, normally I live in an RV when it's not in the shop. Uh, Discord's a great spot for that. It's a little quiet, and so I've been pushing it a lot more lately to make it less quiet, but I like the community we've got over there already, despite the quietness. I think that's all my things. With that, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.